before the break, we will have one final presentation. And to introduce this presentation, I refer to the dinner conversation I had with Maya yesterday, because if I may say, Maya, you had a trip to India the other day, and she said it's also good for a European to have sometimes a look from the outside, because let's say the world is changing and Europe is just one part. Our job here, of course, is to get the European opportunity at desk to work and make this a success. But the outside look is now up to Andrew Wilson from the Australian payer and pharma benefit managing team. So Andrew, thanks very much for joining in. I don't know exactly what time it is now with you, but super that you are on. And his presentation is, of course, to give us an outside look and also an insight into, let's say, their collaboration scheme. As you might have heard, the Canadians, the Australians, and the UK HTA bodies are also starting a collaboration. Not that there is a legal framework as we have the fortunate to have in Europe, but still they are starting that collaboration. And to give us some insights on what he heard now or within the past hour, and of course what they are doing. So Andrew, thanks very much for joining, and the floor is yours. And in terms of slides, just let us know when we should move on, and then Elaine will make sure that it does move on. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's really great to be here to hear this. As an outsider who's been looking at what's been happening in Europe, it's really exciting to see this moving ahead. And and I think there's much that we can all learn from this process. In light of time, I know it's almost coffee time for you and almost wine time for me. I'm going to just cut to the chase on a couple of the points that I want to make in relation to this. I just want, as you were sort of mentioning at that point, that this notion of collaboration between different countries, different states, etc., in relation to this is, it's taking off. And in some ways, the HTA community is sort of a bit behind the ball here. We've got things like the Project Orbis, which is a collaborative approach to certain cancer drugs happening in the regulatory space, and I certainly, as at an individual level, aspire to a much closer and collaborative approach to this. And I actually think at the end of the day, the patient and clinical community will certainly welcome this. I'm just going to start at slide 4 here. But before this, just for those who are not familiar with the Australian scene, there's some slides there that hopefully this will be distributed and people can see some of the background. But really, the key issue from my perspective is that under our system, under our National Health Act, we can only recommend a medicine for listing on the Pharmaceutical Benefit Scheme if we consider it to be cost effective. That's actually set out in legislation, and as far as I'm aware, we were the first country in the world to introduce such a legislative requirement in relation to it, and as a consequence of that, have had a tradition of involvement of HTA within our decision-making process since about 1993. In making our decisions, if we could go to slide 5, please. In making our decisions, there are a number of things that we consider. It's the next slide for me. It's the one that's titled Factors. That's the one. Factors that we must consider in making a recommendation to list the medicine. You won't be surprised about these, but we have to look at the comparative health gain, the size of the effects, including side effects of a new medicine relative to existing therapies, and the clinical importance of these effects. And we have to look at the comparative cost effectiveness. These are the things that we talk about as the sort of quantitative aspects that we look at. And those ticks that I put on there are the things which I think when you think about this where the collaboration that's happening under this new regulation occurs, these are both ones which I think in terms of collaborative health gain, we can clearly see that that's something which is achievable in relation to this. Comparative cost effectiveness is somewhat not going to be fully deliverable through this process, but will certainly help us along the way. And then there are other issues that we have to consider, which are specific to an Australian context, and there'll be, as we just saw from the German context, there'll always be aspects which are specific to particular countries. If we could go to the next slide, please. But there are a lot of other factors that we have to consider in making a value judgment and saying, well, are we going to, is it worth our while investing in public funds and spending public funds on these sorts of on new medicines, new health technologies? And so there are a spectrum of other things that we have to consider, which are not so readily transferable between countries. So we look at things like the clinical need and place and treatment relative to existing therapies, and you would have said, isn't that fairly constant between countries? And we know it's not, that when you look at the way people treat different types of cancers does vary from place to place. What are the sort of different lines of therapy? What's introduced in the different lines? So there is variation there. The spectrum of the severity of disease and its impacts, and when people are prepared to pay to treat for different conditions may be different. The patient and clinician expectations of treatment, which we try to take into account in our decision making, is not necessarily universal. But there are also things like the relative benefits and risks for different patient populations, where the benefit of actually working together is greater because we'll get a better understanding of what some of that between patient variation or within patient population group in relation to us. But basically, just here making the point that overall that there are things which we can, which clearly we should be sharing, and clearly where clinicians and where patients are saying, well, why don't you have a common approach to these things? On the other hand, there are areas where, for very good reasons, these things may be different. We just go to the next slide then, please. So for me, the single point interpretation of the relative clinical effectiveness and relative clinical safety of new health technologies compared to existing technologies, this has got to be something that we find a common way to address this. And I think what I'm hearing today suggests that the European initiative is moving us very strongly in this direction. I can understand concerns from groups like industry about the pace at which that happens. I'm still struggling a little bit to see where the EMA, how they fit into this, and I'll be interested to hear more during discussion how that goes. But it doesn't probably help with some of the decisions about indications for which to seek reimbursement. That's decided by companies. Maybe having a more generic approach will actually lead companies having a more universal approach to the things that they seek subsidy for in different countries. One of the key problems I think that we're all facing is a level of uncertainty as we bring health technologies and bring medicines to patients earlier. It comes with a whole range of greater uncertainties. How this collaborative approach will help us address that uncertainty, how we can do that, how we can manage through that better, is one of the things that I think will be very interested to us to hear more about. And some of the things around the extrapolated benefits and the extent of resource changes in the real world, again, interested to see how these things might go forward. And just last word from me really is to just flag to you that there is a very major review going on in Australia at the moment of our particularly our medicines HTA policies and practices, with proceeding over the next 12 months, and we are looking to learn from wherever we can around the world for a range of these things, and keen to have people's input if they do want to have a look at it. The terms of reference that are in the last couple of slides, but it is also on the government's website. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Andrew. The upcoming coffee break is probably then for you more the wine break already. But I understand that you will also share the discussion panel later on in, let's say, 20 minutes time. Cool.